Hey physiology students, this video is going to be the last installment of the Chapter 4 Part 1 neurotransmitter signaling in a 4-part video sequence. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we're going to pick up where we left off with the third video. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, so last time we had talked quite a bit about neurotransmitter signaling. We've talked about the use of nicotinic and cholinergic receptors. We've talked about the enzyme removal of acetylcholine by acetylcholinesterase. And then we talked about things that can block that enzyme from breaking down acetylcholine and cause cholinergic syndrome. And then we ended it talking about chemicals or toxins that can interfere with acetylcholine signaling, and then talked about things like myasthenia gravis and Alzheimer's. So now we're moving on to the next part. So now we're going to start talking about epinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. Okay, so catecholamines include dopamine, norepinephrine, which is the fight-flight neurotransmitter in your brain and spinal cord, and then epinephrine, which you'll find in your peripheral nervous system during your fight-flight. Now, those three neurotransmitters are called catecholamine. Now, dopamine is actually a catecholamine, and we're going to talk about when signaling with dopamine goes wrong. We're going to talk about depression, okay? All right, and then serotonin is not a catecholamine. It's made from a different amino acid. It's made from tryptophan. You might know that as being found in warm milk or turkey. Okay, so we're going to talk about also how these neurotransmitters are regulated. So, reuptake is one of the ways that a neurotransmitter can be removed from the synapse with a neuron and a skeletal muscle or a smooth muscle, heart muscle, something like that. Now what happens with reuptake is the neuron that secreted the neurotransmitter simply takes that neurotransmitter back up. That's why it's called reuptake. Now serotonin can be removed from the synapse primarily by reuptake. It's not the only way, but it's one of the main ways. Now, reuptake. What are SSRIs? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those are typically drugs used to treat depression and things like that. So we'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So now the other neurotransmitters can be broken down by enzyme activity. So monoamine oxidase. Ase means enzyme, and oxidase means if you oxidate something, you kind of disrupt it. So literally, it's the enzyme that oxidizes monoamine neurotransmitters, and that will include dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Okay, so NAOs can break down your dopamine, your norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and then reuptake is what removes serotonin from the synapse. And it gets a little bit more complicated, but we're gonna break it down for you. So let's move on to the next slide. So there are two types of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. It can be used to remove dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Look, I've also got serotonin in there too. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. So there's MAOI type A or class A, and that is going to it's going to cause more epinephrine, more norepinephrine, and more serotonin to remain in the synapse because it's going to inhibit the activity of monoamine oxidase. See what we're doing there? Let's go back a slide just to make sure you've got this concreted down. So go back to this one. Okay, serotonin, primarily removed from the synapse by reuptake. And there are common drugs called SSRIs that are used when you have serotonin signaling problems. The enzyme breakdown by monoamine oxidase, NAO, what this does, this enzyme normally breaks down monoamine neurotransmitters. It breaks down dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And we'll see on the next slide, it can also work with a little bit of serotonin. So serotonin can be removed two ways, reuptake and also monoamine oxidase. Okay, back to this slide. So monoamine oxidase inhibitor. See the I right here? It is inhibiting the enzyme breakdown of dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and to some extent, a little bit of serotonin. And there's two types of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. You might have heard of the drugs called MAOIs. This is what we're talking about. Okay, so MAOI-A. It's going to inhibit the monoamine oxidase breakdown of norepinephrine and some serotonin. Okay, so there's going to be another monoamine oxidase inhibitor, type B. So type B is an agonist to dopamine because it's going to prevent dopamine breakdown. Now here's how I remember the difference between the A and the B. MAOI class A, I think A for agitation. All right, if you have more norepinephrine in the brain, and norepinephrine is always going to be stimulatory, if you have a high level of norepinephrine, you're going to be agitated. Now, for serotonin, I think of A for appetite because serotonin helps regulate your appetite. All right, I remember that's one of the functions of it. So I think A, agitation, more norepinephrine, A, appetite, serotonin. Now, when I think MAOI class B, I remember it's for dopamine because I think B, I think dope beat. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, but dope is for dopamine, and the beat is if you beat something with like a set of drums, you're using skeletal muscles, fine muscle control, and dopamine plays a role in fine muscle control, so you can lay out a dope beat. I know it's silly, but if you come up with interesting ways to remember this stuff, you will never forget it. But I do have an online reading assignment for MAOIs, and when I pull that up, it might take a second here, or it might not pull up. Let's see. Okay, anticipation. Come on, baby. Come on, Annette. There we go. It's just sluggish today. Okay. Well, I'll give it a minute if it does. There we go. I almost gave up on it. So, MAOIs. We're going to make this bigger for you. MAOI inhibitors block the enzyme monoamine oxidase, and that enzyme is needed to break down monoamine neurotransmitters. So if you inhibit the enzyme, you get more of those neurotransmitters. So they're agonists to those neurotransmitters, okay? And so you can use MAOIs to treat things like Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is the disorder of low dopamine. And the tremors that you see in people with Parkinson's is they don't have enough dopamine for fine motor control. So what do you do with someone with low dopamine? Prevent its enzymatic breakdown. Give them a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and we just learned it was type B for a dope beat. Okay? All right, but I'll let you read more of that on your own. Let's continue on. Okay, serotonin. Here's what serotonin, what we know about it, what it does. There's only 10% of the receptors that you have in your entire body are found in the brain. 90% of serotonin receptors are found in the gut, and we don't even really know exactly what it's doing, but we know it has something to do with appetite. Now, insufficient serotonin, low levels, in the brain is associated with depression, anxiety, things like that. And if we only have 10% of the possible receptors in our brain, if you have low serotonin, you already have very few receptors, so the impact on the brain can be very profound. So, what can you give to build up serotonin in the synapse in someone who's got depression or anxiety and they've got low serotonin? Well, you got two things you could give them, don't you? But there's one thing. I don't know if it's going to show up here. It's not showing up, but here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you. So let me get back to that. Okay, we are now here. Okay, so since this is a video and I can't stop right now, you can give SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? Or MAOI. Now I got to remember what class. Monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Now that's a class A and a class B. So if you remember that serotonin is associated with appetite, then you will know that this answer is going to be, A. Okay, so now let's go. Now I will ask this question, and I'll just talk about it. Didn't save it. Hit save. Okay. Now, would there be multiple drugs to treat the same condition? Why don't you just give someone an SSRI and they'll be on their way, right? What happens if the SSRI doesn't work for that person? We're not carbon cutouts of each other. Each person's physiology is different. So we have different drugs designed to work differently because one drug might not work for everyone. So if the SSRI doesn't work to build up serotonin, hey, try an MAOI class A. Maybe that will work. And so that happens a lot in nursing pharmacology. Okay, so here is an image of serotonin and depression, as it says. So here we have a serotonin neuron that secretes serotonin into the synapse with another neural cell, okay? Now, if you have low serotonin, then less comes into the synapse to be binded by receptors. So if you could give someone an MAOI inhibitor, class A, it will prevent the enzymatic breakdown of serotonin. That's one way to work it. So the serotonin doesn't get broken down, more remains in the synapse, and that takes care of that. If that doesn't work, you could try a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drug, and that would basically prevent this serotonin neuron from taking back up serotonin into the vesicles. And so the same thing happens, more serotonin remains in the synapse. You can treat a problem with two possible drugs that work differently. Kind of cool, right? Okay, let's talk about dopamine. Okay, dopamine is produced by dopamine-producing neurons in the brain, and many of those neurons are found in your midbrain, and it's called the substantia nigra, part of the midbrain. So if you took anatomy, hopefully you remember what the midbrain is. Now, dopamine has a few functions. One, like I mentioned before, is fine motor control. All right, I don't know exactly how it does it, but it is involved, and that's called the nigrostantial dopamine system. The nigrostantial is because substantia nigra is the part of the midbrain where those neurons are found. Now, we know that things like Parkinson's, which is a neurological disorder and a neuromuscular disorder, and I've got an online app which you could look at on your own, but we know it's because of low dopamine. It's also some other things going on, but let's focus on the dopamine. Okay, now, if someone's got low dopamine, what could you give them? What pharmacological drug could you give them? I'm not going to stop and write it down this time, but think about it. Dope beat, right? Monoamine oxidase inhibitor, class B, because that's going to prevent the enzyme breakdown of dopamine and more of it builds up in the synapse and it can alleviate some of the symptoms. Now, too little dopamine is a problem, but too much is also a problem. So more recently, they found that high dopamine or excess dopamine is found in people who have schizophrenia. This is people who hear voices and things like that. And so what would you treat a person with schizophrenia? You might want to give them a dopamine blocker. I'm not going to give you an example, but I'm sure you can Google it, but you'd want to cut down how much dopamine that person's being exposed to. Okay. Now, dopamine does other things. It's part of your reward system. So when you do something that feels good, or you eat something that tastes good, you get a little dopamine release in your brain, and that kind of cements, you do this thing and it feels good, and it strengthens those neural pathways. Well, what this is involved in is the mesolimbic dopamine system. The mesolimbic is, well, midbrain, because that's where these neurons are found, and limbic is basically the emotional part of your brain. It does many other things, but so addiction. When you get mentally addicted to substance, usually you think about drug abuse. The mental addiction is because you got a dopamine release every time you tasted something good or did something good. And in your brain, you become addicted to that dopamine release. Okay, so brain's pleasure center, all right, which includes the limbic system. So don't memorize all of this stuff, but while eating food, you get a dopamine release, and it binds to receptors, and you get that feel-good part of your brain. Abusing certain drugs, you also get a dopamine release. I think even with smoking cigarettes, you get a dopamine release. So when you're looking at this PowerPoint online, you can click this link and go to this article and read about how dopamine is associated with the pleasure center of the brain because of the mesolimbic dopamine system. All right, that dopamine can get you addicted. All right, so speaking of addictive drugs, cocaine and dopamine and addiction. And there's a clinical app online, and you go to the wiki textbook on these pages here, and you can read a little bit about it. But cocaine hits them all, like methamphetamine and all those things. They all kind of do the same thing. They're an agonist to dopamine, they're an agonist to serotonin, and they're an agonist to norepinephrine, and I don't have it here, but also to epinephrine. It hits all of those neurotransmitters. So with too much serotonin, you can have hallucinations, all right? With too much dopamine, you can have muscle tremors because they're, fine motor control is most dopamine, and addiction because dopamine release happens when you do something that feels good. Now, you can have high energy, fight, flight, be jacked up out of your brain because of too much norepinephrine in your brain and too much epinephrine in your peripheral nervous system. So, yeah, cocaine, don't do it. All right. Now, speaking of fight, flight, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Norepinephrine is the fight, flight neurotransmitter in your brain, and epinephrine is the fight, flight neurotransmitter in your peripheral nervous system, so outside the spinal cord. They're also known as noradrenaline, or epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. Most people are familiar with those names more than norepinephrine and epinephrine. Well, anyway, epinephrine in your peripheral nervous system is that flush of adrenaline you get when you feel like your life's in danger. And we probably all had that feeling, right? So it is coming from your adrenal glands. Your hypothalamus causes it to be squirted out your adrenal glands, and it's going to stimulate some activities and inhibit others, okay? Now, norepinephrine is in your brain and spinal cord, and it's always stimulatory there. Okay, so when you have a fight-flight situation, it seems like the whole world is slowing down. Well, you're not a mutant to X-Men, okay? You don't have that kind of power. But what is happening is in your brain, norepinephrine is increasing the rate at which your brain is functioning. All your senses are heightened, and that's what makes it seem like things are slowing down. It's actually your brain's working faster, because that might save you. Now, in your peripheral nervous system, I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. What happens is some things speed up. In your thoracic cage, your heart and your lungs are located there, right? It's going to stimulate those. So epinephrine is going to make your heart rate skyrocket, all right? And if I add some information on it, it's going to be by opening up sodium and calcium channels in the heart. Now, in your lungs, the smooth muscle, epinephrine is going to cause your bronchioles to open up wide. It's called bronchodilation, because that could save your life. Increased heart rate increases the rate that glucose and oxygen get to your body, especially your brain, which you want to have working in fight flight, and your skeletal muscles, which are going to need a lot of oxygen and glucose to run and escape, all right? Now, those things get stimulated. Your GI tract is inhibited. Your GI tract functions digesting, and that's not going to save your life. Epinephrine shuts all that down, okay? If it's not going to save your life, shut it down. Increase activity in things that will save your life. So just think of it that way. Okay, so there's two types of, well, they're G protein coupled receptors, but they're really muscarinic receptors. Okay, so alpha adrenergic, it's a muscarinic receptor. Remember, for muscarinic receptors, you must. It's for autonomic body functions, things you can't control. Now, this receptor is named after the neurotransmitter to which it binds. It binds to epinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. So the receptor is called adrenergic, and an adrenaline receptor, adrenergic receptor, okay? Now, alpha adrenergic receptors, alpha. I want you to think alpha, think A, because it starts with an A, right? You know something else that starts with an A? An apple. What do you do with an apple? You bite it, you eat it, you digest it. An alpha adrenergic receptor is an epinephrine receptor found on your GI tract structures, your digestive structures. So you'll find it on smooth muscle of your intestines, and you'll find it on the glands of your GI tract. And what will happen is, since digestion's not going to save you in fight-flight, so epinephrine is going to basically shut it down. Epinephrine binds to this receptor on your GI tract, even arteries going to your GI tract, it shuts it all down. So in this case, epinephrine is inhibiting or slowing something down. So think things happen in your abdominal cavity in fight flight, shut it down. It's not going to save you. In your thoracic cage, however, there are things there that can save you. Let's stimulate those. That works by a different receptor. Okay, so there's your apple. Think alpha. Shut it down. It's not going to save you. Now, beta adrenergic receptors, and there's the symbol for beta. Now, beta adrenergic, we've got two types. We've got one for the heart, and that's going to be the beta 1 adrenergic receptor. So here's how you remember this, because there's going to be a beta 1 and a beta 2 adrenergic receptor. How many hearts do you have? You only got one, okay? So beta 1 adrenergic receptor. When epinephrine binds to this receptor on your heart, it's going to speed up your heart rate because that's going to save your life. All right, so real fast. Now, beta 2 is going to, this receptor is for epinephrine, and it's located on the bronchial smooth muscle. Now, what's going to happen when epinephrine binds here? It's going to cause your bronchioles to open up wide or bronchodilate. If you're in fight flight, you need to get as much oxygen into your body as possible. And so you want those airways to open up, okay? So how many lungs do you have? Look at the figure. You got 2, beta 2, okay? So beta 1, you got 1 heart. That's the receptor for epinephrine on the heart. Beta 2, you got 2 lungs. That's for the epinephrine receptor on your bronchioles. Now, it also says here, beta 2 adrenergic receptors vasodilate arteries to your skeletal muscles. You want to open up blood flow to your skeletal muscles so they have plenty of oxygen and glucose to run away. So what you can remember is beta 2 adrenergic receptor is best to get away. Beta 2, best to get away. Okay, it's silly, but it works. Remember, best to get away by running, by getting blood supply to your skeletal muscles. You have 2 lungs, beta 2. 1 heart, beta 1. Alpha, apple, digestion. So study that and you won't go wrong. Now, let's do some application of these receptors. And I've crossed off what you don't need to know, but we talked about what the heart does under the influence of epinephrine, what your GI tract does, blood flow to your skeletal muscles. We talked about what your bronchioles do, and here's more GI stuff. So it says the receptor, your heart, beta 1 adrenergic receptor, 1 heart, beta 1. Now alpha here and down here is for all things digestive. It's for GI tract smooth muscle, for peristalsis, shut it down. It's for GI gland secretions, not going to save your life, shut it down. That's why you've got dry mouth when you're scared, because your salivary glands are part of your GI tract. Okay, movement of food to your stomach, shut it down. The sphincters allowing food into the stomach or out of it, shut it down. It's all alpha, alpha, apple, digestion. Okay, skeletal muscles, blood supply to them, best to get away. Beta 2 adrenergic receptors opens up arteries to your skeletal muscles so you can run away. Your lungs, it's fight flight. You want them to open up wide. You've got 2 lungs. Beta 2 adrenergic receptor will bind with epinephrine and your airways will open up wide. Okay, now that we know how these body functions, these autonomic body functions happen, what epinephrine receptor they work by, and I've given you 3 now, let's talk about drugs that are agonists or blockers to these receptors. So I've got a clinical app online which you can follow on your own. But let's talk about a beta 1 agonist, dobutamine. The beta 1 receptor is on your heart and it will make your heart rate go up. If your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. What do you have to do to get someone who has high blood pressure to get their blood pressure down? You can give them, well, I'm going backwards here. Dobutamine is a beta 1 agonist, okay? And what it will do is it will stimulate the beta 1 receptor on the heart. It's not changing the neurotransmitter, it's actually stimulating the receptor directly. If someone their heart isn't functioning very well, it's not keeping up the pace with the body's demands for oxygen and blood, people who have heart failure or other cardiac problems, you can give them dobutamine and it will stimulate the beta 1 receptor on the heart and make heart rate go up and increase cardiac output. So here's how you can remember this drug. Dobutamine makes the heart beat faster. All right, so that's a beta-1 agonist. Here's another agonist. It is an agonist to both the beta-1 receptor on the heart, making heart rate go up, and it's also an agonist to the beta-2 receptors on your bronchioles. So it will increase heart rate and open up the airways, bronchodilate the airways, and that's what's called isoproterenol, that drug. Okay. Beta-2 agonists, strictly the beta-2. If you have someone with respiratory problems, like asthma, in asthma what happens is something causes the bronchioles to spasm and they shut down. And so when a person has an asthmatic attack, they have an inhaler, right? And that could contain things like albuterol or terbutaline, and there's other formulations. But what those drugs are, the rescue inhalers, is it's a beta-2 agonist. It's going to stimulate the beta-2 receptors on the bronchioles and cause them to open up wide so that you can breathe again. All right, so you might not have heard of dobutamine. You might not have ever heard of isoproterenol, but I bet you've heard of albuterol. Okay, now we're going to talk about blockers. These three were agonists. We're going to talk about blockers. So, talking about high blood pressure, it's one of the big three in the PD: high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease. Well, what happens if you have chronic high blood pressure? Well, you got to get that blood pressure down or it's going to cause problems. Now, one of the first beta blockers that was designed was called propranolol. Now, what this does, it's a beta-1 blocker, but it also blocks beta-2 receptors. It's good for some patients, but not good for others. So it's both a beta-1 and a beta-2 blocker. It will block the beta-1 receptor on your heart, so that epinephrine can't make your heart rate go up. Your heart rate goes down if you block that receptor. And if your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down. But it will also block the beta-2 receptor on your bronchioles and can cause them to bronchoconstrict a little bit. Now, if you have a patient with high blood pressure and they don't have any known respiratory problems, this drug is absolutely fine with them. It's probably one of the cheaper ones now because it's older. But if you have a patient that has high blood pressure and asthma or COPD or any other respiratory problem, you don't want to give them this drug because, yeah, you'll block that receptor on the heart, heart rate will come down, blood pressure will come down, but you'll also narrow their airways because of the beta-2 blocking effect, and you could drive them into a respiratory crisis. So there's a better drug for someone with two problems like that. A beta-1 specific blocker called atenolol. This one only blocks the beta-1 receptor on the heart, brings blood pressure down, but doesn't affect the bronchioles. So if they have a respiratory problem, it's not going to touch the bronchioles. All right, so that's a very common beta blocker, and you'll definitely encounter it in nursing. Okay, well, we're almost done with the neurotransmitter lecture here. We're going to talk about a few more. So glutamate is a stimulatory neurotransmitter. It's always stimulating in the brain. And the other two are inhibitory. Glycine is found in the spinal cord, and it's inhibitory. And GABA is inhibitory in the brain. And I always remember that GABA is inhibitory in the brain because it's got a B in it, so I think brain. All right? Well, so glutamate. It's actually found in MSG, which is that additive they give to give food that more savory taste to it. It's stimulatory in most of your brain synapses, is 80 to 90%, so that's the majority of your brain. Now, it's removed from synapses in the brain by astrocytes, and they were part of your blood-brain barrier from the beginning part of our lecture. Now, some people have too much glutamate produced in their brain, and it causes a toxicity. And we have since found, researchers have found, that too much glutamate is associated with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So we've got several things going on with Alzheimer's. With Alzheimer's, you are losing acetylcholine-producing neurons in the brain, so acetylcholine is low, and glutamate is too high. Parkinson's is due to low dopamine, but now we know it's also due to excess glutamate. Okay? Okay, well, let's move on. We'll talk about glycine. Glycine, I always remember serine, which means you're calm, you're soothing. Serine, like glycine in the spinal cord. I've got all the S sounds. All right? Glycine is found in the spinal cord. It's inhibitory, so serine. And what it does, it plays a very important role. Now, in anatomy, you learn that if you want to flex the biceps brachii muscle, we now know That happens because the musculocutaneous nerve secretes acetylcholine and binds to muscle fibers, opens up sodium channels, and that causes the muscle to contract. Okay, but guess what? The opposing muscle, the triceps on the opposite body region, has to be made to be inhibited while the primary muscle is being stimulated. You don't want the triceps fighting the biceps when you're trying to get contraction in the biceps. So at the same time, a stimulatory signal is given to the biceps to contract. An inhibitory signal is coming from glycine from the spinal cord to make your triceps relax and not fight that. So anytime you have opposing muscles on each side of the body, when one's being stimulated, the other one's being inhibited, usually by glycine. All right? Okay, so a little physiology knowledge. Now, an application, strychnine, which you might not encounter in human medicine, but you could. Someone could get poisoned by strychnine. I know in the veterinary world that people throw out food and it's got strychnine poison in it, and it kills animals. It could kill a person. And what it does is you need glycine to get muscles to relax. Your main respiratory muscle, the diaphragm, when it relaxes under the influence of glycine, it allows you to exhale air. And when it contracts, you pull air into your body. When it relaxes, you exhale. Strychnine inhibits the glycine relaxation of the diaphragm. Basically, your diaphragm is paralyzed now, and you can't breathe. You can't exhale. Okay, if you can't evacuate the air that's in your lungs, you can't make way for air to come into your lungs, and you die from asphyxiation. It's kind of a terrible way to go, but it affects glycine. Let's move on to GABA. So GABA is inhibitory. It opens chloride ion channels. It's found primarily in the brain. So when your brain, parts of your brain are being quieted, it's by GABA. All right, when you fall asleep and you start to go from conscious to unconscious, GABA starts quieting your brain so you can block out unimportant stimuli and fall asleep and go into deep sleep. GABA also coordinates muscle movement in your cerebellum, and GABA also quiets your skeletal muscles. When you're falling asleep, your skeletal muscles are inhibited so you don't get up and move around while you're asleep and hurt yourself. GABA plays a role in that, okay? Quiets your brain, quiets your skeletal muscles, and is important. Now, Xanax is commonly prescribed for anxiety, and it calms people who are having a panic attack. And what it does, it's an agonist to GABA in the brain, and it's going to quiet your brain down, hopefully get that panic attack to pass. All right, so Xanax is a GABA agonist. Now, the reason I have Jack Nicholson from the movie Anger Management is, well, he had a lot of patients that had panic attacks and anger, and Xanax works that way. Another reason I remember it is because he made his patients say goose fraba, and I think goose fraba is supposed to calm them down, and I think GABA. All right, silly, I know, but if you come up with interesting ways to remember things, you'll never forget them. Okay, we got one last neurotransmitter. You're saying, yay. So, but before I go on, Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, and it means if you inherit one copy of the gene, you're going to express the trait. And the onset of the disease doesn't seem to happen until later in life, so unfortunately people have probably passed it on. But Huntington's disease has got there's lots of things going on with it, but low GABA seems to be playing a role in it, okay? So if you're having low GABA and you have Huntington's disease, you could take a GABA agonist, and there's more than just Xanax, okay? And that would promote more GABA-like activity, and it might calm all the spastic muscle activity that happens in people with Huntington's. So there's lots of nursing application to these neurotransmitters, okay? So Valium is a good treatment for Huntington's as well. In fact, more so than Xanax. But Valium is a GABA agonist. If you remember back in the treatment of cholinergic syndrome, Valium, when someone's having seizures from cholinergic syndrome, Valium quiets the skeletal muscles, all right? And it does it by stimulating GABA, okay? So I'm overlapping with previous lectures. Now we'll move on. The last neurotransmitter is nitric oxide, and I've got a clinical, not a clinical app, but a writing assignment example online. If you click here, you'll go to it. Now, nitric oxide, you're like, who cares about nitric oxide? If you know of anyone who's ever had erectile dysfunction, you're going to care about nitric oxide. So let's talk about what it does. So during sexual arousal, there is in the penis two spongy chambers that fill with blood, the corpus cavernosa, right? You learned that in anatomy. Well, stimulation during sexual arousal causes nitric oxide in those spongy chambers to be produced. And what that causes to happen is it causes basically the production of cGMP. It's a second messenger. It's similar to similar to CAMP, all right, but it's cGMP. Now, what this molecule does is it causes the arteries that are found in the corpus cavernosa of the penis, causes the arteries to vasodilate. And what happens when you vasodilate something? You get more blood flow. And so it allows all this blood to fill these spongy chambers, and its hydraulics, fluid trapped in a confined space, builds up pressure, and so you get an erection. Now, once the stimulus is done, the erection has to go away. And so you have to be able to get that messenger, cGMP, out, okay? So normally there's an enzyme that breaks down this second messenger called phosphodiesterase, and it breaks down the cGMP, so the arteries vasoconstrict and the blood evacuates and the erection goes away, all right? Now, people who have erectile dysfunction, it could be many things. It could be a psychological problem, but it also could be a blood flow problem. Some people who have heart problems and diabetes often have erectile dysfunction if it's affecting their circulation. So drugs like Viagra, Cialis, Levitra, they work as an inhibitor to phosphodiesterase. What they do is they prevent phosphodiesterase from working, and if this is not working, cGMP is not getting broken down. cGMP builds up. It causes more arterial vasodilation for an erection. So these drugs are phosphodiesterase inhibitors, and they work as cGMP agonists by preventing its breakdown. Okay? All right, so here we have another neurotransmitter, and what happens, an enzyme breaks down something important, and if you block that enzyme, you get a pharmacological effect. All right, congratulations, physiology students. You have finished the chapter on neurotransmitters. All right, congratulations, I knew you could do it. All right.